Now, in this lecture segment, we'll look at the Workbench GUI MySQL client as an alternative to the MySQL text client. So we'll start Workbench. It's a menu option on the MySQL menu, and we'll use it to set up the Bakery 1 database a second time. I've removed the Bakery 1 database that we did in the prior section, so we'll have to redo it. Having started it, generally via the menu or a shortcut that's set up during installation, we get this view here. And be sure that the leftmost tab here with the Home symbol shows. And this Home tab has 3 panels. We'll use the SQL Development panel here for most work. The center panel, Data Modeling, offers database design tools we might look at later, and the rightmost, Server Administration, offers administration tools for things like setting up new users on the server. The SQL Development panel lets you set up database connections. These are saved configurations of database server, username, and password that you can just click on to immediately log into the database and get a window for SQL command interaction. Let's create a new connection, as I am doing here. Fill in your username. I have root there. And give the connection itself a name. I'll call it DBIntro for display on the SQL Development panel. Now, you can use root for now, since you do have a root user, but as we mentioned earlier, ultimately you should use the Server Administration panel over here to do a new user, create a new user that's not root for your routine use. If you store a password in the vault, as it's put here, store in vault, then Workbench will remember it for you. Otherwise, you get to re-enter it each time that you connect. So I like to have my passwords remembered for me. And note also here the host name field. Leave this as the default, 127.0.0.1. That indicates your current machine, whatever you're on. And that's where the database server will be expected to be. But note that later in the course you may need to connect to a MySQL server on another machine. And to set up a connection to a server on another machine, you fill in that machine's IP address or host name in the host name field. The port field here is also worth discussing. You may know that each server program on a host machine has a port number on which it accepts connection requests. Web servers, for instance, usually accept connections on port 80. And MySQL servers use port 3306 for connections, and the default port value is therefore almost always correct. But you might encounter MySQL servers configured for different ports, and in that case you'd enter a different port number here. Almost every MySQL client program lets you specify a host machine and a port. Even MySQL, the command client, does so via command line arguments that we may discuss later, and which you can look up, of course, as well. So, having built this, let's save our new connection. And then it appears under the SQL Development tab. Now, click on it. And what it should do is give you a new tab with a SQL editor right here in the center. Now, this editor works a lot like MySQL, but there are differences. It's a full text editor, not a command line session. You can save and load its contents, a little save command or a save icon there, for instance. Anytime you click this little lightning stroke, then everything in the editor gets run, not just the line you most recently added. If you highlight lines, though, then only those get run. And you can't use non-SQL commands like source. As I said earlier, that command is MySQL specific, MySQL command line specific. Instead, you run Bakery SQL by loading it into the editor via the toolbar buttons and clicking that lightning stroke. So do that now. Let's open a script file. And I have it down in Datasets Bakery. and then lightning stroke it. And you can see the result going on down here. And now we have a Bakery 1 database. A database browsing panel shows on the left, as you can see here, and I clicked the small refresh button. You should do the same on the upper right, and that makes the Bakery 1 database show in the list. This object browser panel is Workbook's GUI alternative to show databases, show tables, etc. It shows a list of all databases accessible on the server, which expand in turn to show details like tables, and then in turn columns underneath the tables. You can expand yours likewise to see this, and so be sure you do that and determine that you have a Bakery 1 database with the expected tables. And note, you won't have all the other databases that I do, for the same reason as given in the MySQL discussion. My MySQL server is set up for lots of different applications. By the way, loading bakery1.sql gives you a good look at a sophisticated SQL file here. You don't need to understand all of that, though you'll understand most of it by the end of the course. Here's one quick question to consider, though. We already had a Bakery 1 database from our MySQL session. I did say I deleted it, but even if I hadn't, this would have worked just fine. So what happened to the one that was already there when we ran Bakery SQL 1 again under Workbench? And you can make a good guess by just looking at bakery1.sql's first several lines up here. Did we add to the existing database? Did we overwrite it? Or what? And a quick look at the lines here does show this drop database if exists Bakery 1. And that's a pretty good clue. Basically, it removes the existing Bakery 1 database before creating and filling a new one if the existing one does exist. And also, to be honest, looks like SQL is prone to odd, clunky syntax. Drop database if exists. That's 1970s language design for you, and you'll get used to it. And so finally, as a final question here, use what you've learned about Workbench to show the contents of the customer table via a select statement. And think back to what I said about things like the entire content being executed, the entire content of the center panel here getting executed. So if you give it some thought, one of the first things I think you're going to want to do here is get rid of all this stuff, which we can do a variety of ways, but highlighting the entire thing and deleting it is brute force, but will work. And having cleared all that out, then I do a select star from customer. Let's see what happens if I run the lightning bolt here. And what we get is a small panel below that shows the result of that select in the way that we saw in the command line, but in its own separate small panel. So that wraps up our brief overview of the MySQL Workbench. And which of the two tools you choose to use is up to you. But you want to be familiar with both of them.